Why don't we begin? Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Brandon. I'm Senior Director of International Relations Programs for the Asia Foundation in Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome you this morning to today's webinar titled Enduring the Pandemic, Survey on the Impact of COVID-19 on Micro, Small, and Medium-Sized Enterprises in the Tourism Sector and Households in Cambodia. This webinar also goes by the same name of a report that was released earlier today in Cambodia and is now on the Asia Foundation's website, which I believe you can download. It's already on our chat box. We have a good turnout today. We have people both around the United States as well as in Cambodia. So thank you very much for joining. In October, we held a similar type of webinar as it pertained to Thailand, the impact of COVID-19 on the tourism and manufacturing sectors in Thailand, and we're pleased to be able to host this meeting today and on Cambodia. There were a number of surveys taken over the past several months in 4 other Southeast Asian countries as well, and those were Malaysia, Laos, Myanmar, and Timor-Leste. So we hope to be able to have webinars looking at how COVID has impacted those countries as well. Clearly, COVID has had a devastating impact on countries throughout the world, and not just the impact of illness and death, but the impact on the severe impact on a country's economy and the global economy. And Cambodia is no exception. And we're pleased to have 3 speakers today to talk about this. All are in Cambodia. Our first speaker is Melanie Limburg. She's our country representative based in Phnom Penh. Our second speaker will be Mr. U Virak, who is the founder and president of the Future Forum, and he's going to talk about the surveys, the impact of COVID on households. And our third speaker will be Mr. Chan Sopal, who is the director of the Center for Policy Studies in Phnom Penh, who's going to talk about the impact of COVID on SMEs in the tourism sector. Let me just briefly introduce each of our speakers before we turn to them. As I said, Melanie has been our country representative based in Phnom Penh. She has a long history with the Asia Foundation. She served as our country representative in Mongolia for many years, as well as our deputy country representatives in Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, and the Philippines. And she has managed a diverse program portfolio over those years. Her assignments have included improving the capacity of knowledge institutions to undertake quality research to inform public policy, such as what this survey is doing today, advancing transparent and accountable governance, enhancing citizens' participation, promoting women's economic rights, and fostering regional cooperation, among other issues. Our second speaker, Mr. U Virak, as I said, is the founder and president of the Future Forum. He's one of Cambodia's most prominent and principal political analysts and human rights activists with proven expertise in strengthening grassroots movements, conducting political economy analyses, and spearheading organizational development and directing risk assessments. Prior to joining the Future Forum in 2015, Mr. Virak led the Cambodian Center for Human Rights, one of Cambodia's premier human rights organizations. He has led successful campaigns to free human rights activists and has tackled some of the most controversial issues in Cambodia: rule of law, freedom of expression, racism, LGBT rights, forced evictions, among other issues. Our third speaker is Mr. Chan Sopal. He's the director of the Center for Policy Studies, a Cambodian think tank providing research and consulting services in the areas of economic development, mainly in agriculture and land. For the past 27 years, he's been a researcher and manager in various institutions. He has a master's in agricultural economics from the University of London, Imperial College in the United Kingdom. Melanie will introduce the program first, followed by Mr. Virak and then Mr. Sopal. And so, Melanie, the floor is yours. And again, thank you all for coming. Melanie?
Thank you so much, John, for your very kind introduction. And I'm really very pleased to be with all of you here this morning in Washington. In April of 2020, colleagues across the Asia Foundation began to discuss what we were seeing in front of us here. We were here in Asia. Myself, I was here in Cambodia, and we wanted to see if we could better understand what the unfolding impact of the COVID-19 pandemic was having, particularly on micro and small enterprises, workers, and households. And here in Southeast Asia, we focused, as you've heard, just as John mentioned, predominantly on MSMEs, which of course, here many in Cambodia are unregistered, but they are certainly the engines of the economy. It was from really this discussion that we started in April that we selected two respected independent think tanks here in Cambodia that you are going to hear from today, both Mr. Sopal from the Center for Policy Studies and Mr. Virak from Future Forum, and our partner, Anchor Research, to really step out and conduct a panel series of 3 surveys. The first survey was conducted between May and June of 2020. The second was done between August and October. And the final one has started in, for the most part, in between December and will be ending in February. At the country level, the purpose of these surveys is to inform ongoing government responses, actions, and plans to support and reinvigorate local economies. Further, we also wanted to have some comparative data across Southeast Asia, which is nearly ready to be compiled very shortly into a regional piece that will be available in the coming months. In terms of methodology, the household study that was conducted by Future Forum with Anchor Research looked at a representative sample of 1,000 households that derive their income from many sources. And the survey takes a close look at their household situation before and during the pandemic. With the Center for Policy Studies, we reached nearly 950 micro and small enterprises, also a representative sample, in the tourism sector, a sector that has experienced the effects of the pandemic acutely. Earlier today, we released the combined findings from this first of the 3 surveys in a publication you've just heard about entitled Enduring the Pandemic, Surveys on the Impact of COVID-19 in Cambodia. We hope that this will form a baseline to continue to inform policy options going forward. In closing, I would like to recognize the important supporters for these surveys and studies that include the Australian government, the New Zealand government, and the Asia Foundation's congressional appropriation. Thank you so much for taking time to join us this morning, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Melanie. Let's turn it now over to Virak. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Melanie. Good morning and good evening. Good morning to you, to those of you who are in the West, particularly in the US, and good evening to everybody else in Cambodia. We're quite late now, but I think pleased to see some of our colleagues joining us. In the surveys that was done we started discussions about this surveys on household. It was brought up to my attention by our partner, Uncle Research, our friend Ian at Uncle Research, and had this discussion quite early on, knowing full well that the pandemic will be widespread and the effect will be significant, and the situation could be dire for many of the people. And so in regarding that, we actually has designed and conduct the first survey back in April. And the way we designed the survey was to try to ask the households, their households situations before the pandemic hit. That was looking back and try to re-establish or establish a baseline, a pre-COVID per se, so we can have something to compare. And the way we want to do it is to look through different times, and the focus of the surveys, as Melanie has mentioned, was to look at household income, how the pandemic has affected household incomes, wage earners, as well as the micro and small enterprises. And I think if you look at the case of Cambodia, the way we designed it, we actually purposefully selected 5 areas, as we cannot do a countrywide random survey. We in fact did the survey through face-to-face interview. In April, the situation in Cambodia was quite controlled, or the situation was somewhat okay, and the government allowed us to do face-to-face interview, given that we actually had protections in different measures in place that allowed us to do that properly. I think if so to go, let's skip that and let's move on to the next slide, and we can move on to the results. Next slide, please. So can we move on to the next slide? And next, please. So we look at the number of households. As you can see, the interviews, number of households we interview is at over 1,000 household. Average household size is about 5 per household. Most are Khmer nationals with pretty average education at a pretty low level of 5.5. Most of the households interviews, as you can see, we end up with 933 households enterprises responding to the survey. And if you look at just the overall, trying to capture the overall result, we see, just for example, we did a follow-up survey in June, and we already see closures, significant closures of household. We're looking around 20% of businesses or household enterprises have closed down between April and June. But when we try to look at the different incomes, so the 2 things that we actually tried to check was actually incomes of household incomes, as well as the wage income. And as you can see in the next slide, you will see the significant drop of both of them. In between January, so from the baseline questions that we have and to the April result from the survey, the decrease, the household income has decreased by 40%, and that further decreased another 8% by June of 2020. And as I said, I think that number is very, very significant. Next slide, please. And these main reasons are not surprising. If you look at the main reasons why wage earnings and household incomes are dropped, the significant over there has something to do with if you look at household income, is lack of customers. Many people are not, particularly in March and April, when the country was under small but partial and partial lockdown. We seen a significant hits of household income, and the lack of customers, lack of sales, the afraid of COVID are generally reported as the main reasons. For wage earners, the factory closure, reductions of number of hours, no overtime were the reasons cited by the households. Next slide, please. So if you look at the waged income, the workers' income, these are the averaged income for people in different sectors, from private companies to farmers for hire, drivers. As you can see, the different graphs shows the difference between January, April, and June. As you can see, that there's a consistent pattern of downward pattern. That means that the incomes for pretty much every sector has declined, except for farmers were higher and drier in June, because there's an indication that many of these people seek or have access to more work, particularly as tuk-tuk drivers, or particularly when during the pandemic, as more people starting to order online, and there's more deliveries of food as well as the other necessities. Farmers are high is a very interesting finding, because in general, the two surveys that we have done, we actually did a third one in October, and the results of that is being analyzed right now. But the indications from that is, in general, there's actually a significant pattern that we have seen, and that is many more people are moving back to their homeland, their farmland, and their villages, and starting to farms. And we have seen a significant increase from April to October of the number of people who become part-time farmers again. Next slide, please. As we also look at the savings and debts, and in this slide you see that the saving, we're looking at three forms of common forms of savings in Cambodia, and of course number one is cash, platin is a mixed gold, and the third one is gold. And as you can see, the number in the total saving of households were reported in January before the pandemic was at 63% of households with savings, and that number go down to 37%. So it's a flip of 2/3 to 1/3 of people with savings. So it's only 1/3 of the population of the people we survey that continue to have savings by June. But also the number indicating that the next slide will show that those people who still continue to have savings have less of them. And so you look at the drop of saving from January to April to June, but also the value of the average values of household savings was also declining, and the decrease continue until January, and that numbers go from April of 733 to 412. So the people who the 1/3 of the households that continue to have saving by June have very little of them left, and that means 63% of the households have no saving, zero saving, zero saving. Next slide, please. And we also try to capture food insecurity, as we anticipate that the pandemic, while the economy, the GDP numbers might be saying something, we felt that the biggest indicators of people's well-being would be food security, and that number is also showing up in a significant way, in a way that's pretty scary. The number is pretty scary because when we measure food security, this is just the different ways of measuring food security. And next slide, please. And as you can see, the people, if you look at the bottom, so we look at moderate food insecurity and severe food insecurity. The average is actually 20% of households are either moderate or severe, and that you look at 17 or so % of the population of households are facing moderate food insecurity. And these people could actually go one day without food, and then you have 2.7% face severe food insecurity, and that is a very high number. And there's no surprise when we did the survey that Siem Reap, the provincial town, the province that depends heavily on tourism, has the highest percentage of food insecurity, and that at 31%, followed by Phnom Penh and fighting at 20%, but the average of total is 20%. Next slide, please. If you look at remittances, that number is also declining from 15 to 10%. There's people, migrant workers who used to send money from Thailand, for example, are no longer able to do that. or they are sending in smaller amount of money for those that continue to do so. There's more people moving from their workplace to back home, as I said earlier. Next slide, please. And this is the issues that we also paid close attention to, and this has something to do with the debts, but not just any debts. Cambodia has one of the highest microfinance debts in the world. We're looking at almost at 2 million households, 2 million outstanding loans, and that show in our study. There's a slight increase of people borrowing more money from January to April of 6%, but there's no change in June. And the main reason we believe to be the reason why there's no change from April to June was because microfinance are much more restrictive in their lending, given the economic situation and the ability of households to pay back, as well as potential political risk associated with lending, and particularly on the microfinance issues, which is now becoming a more sensitive issue in the country. As you see, the median families owe actually decreased from January to April and then to June. And that means that while there's more borrowing, some families actually decided to pay some of their debts off, which is an interesting numbers. Could not be explained from our study, but there's certain possible explanations that I think would be difficult to find justifications. So we're just going to move to the next slide. Next slide, please. There's some response from the lenders, from the microfinance institutions, and as you can see, the delay of payment and reduced monthly repayments are the two most common positive response from the lenders. The government did not make that mandatory, in fact, but I think the microfinance, the lenders negotiating some of the term, but as you can see, even they delay the payment. There's hardly any freeze to the interest, and that just means that at the end of the pandemic, the potential rise in debts would still be there, particularly for those people with less and less saving. Next, please. And just there's new loans. We've learned that much of the new loans are actually going to consumption, buying food, buying necessities, not going to productive use, and that's pretty expected. And of course, of course 1/3 of the new loans are going to paying other loans and supporting the daily expenses. Next, please. And this is the number of household, the indebted household who were at least 1 month late with their loan repayment. And if you look at that, that number in January was at from 5% to 19% by June. That's an increase of 4 times. The defaults of microfinance loan in Cambodia has been remarkably low, but that increase in 2020 is something that's very concerning for the industry as well. Next, please. And 7.6% of the households that receive any support from government and NGOs by April, which means that more than 90% of the population, the households, did not get any support from the government in April. That number changed a bit by June. There's more of cash transfer, particularly to those people with ID poor, but that's not still does not make up the majority. From the latest data from our survey from October, we have seen better numbers from this part. Thank you. Next one. In June, only 39 families out of 1,000-something families, has 3.7% report receiving any form of support from non-governmental organizations. And this is including international intergovernmental organizations also. Interestingly, 139 families hold ID poor. There's a system in Cambodia called ID poor, where poor households are actually given an ID card. 65% of the families report receiving government cash transfer. That number seems to be going up, and because in June, when we did the survey, the government only a month or so before that announced the cash transfer, and that number was not as what we want, but was promising. Most reported needs by households themselves was money and food. Next one. They're just the impact of the household, as you can see from the graphs, impact the household income the most, and if you look at actually if you look at the wage, the decrease was a little less. It's around 30-something%. Just most families no longer have savings by the end of June. Next, please. A looming debt crisis, and this is something that we allude to. I alluded to earlier, and that even after the pandemic is over and there's an economic recovery, for many of the poor families who are getting into bigger debt and little savings, that situation might not be rosy, and a hope for a V-shaped recovery will not be equally could not be equally done in a way that the impact will not be equitable. The poor, and if you look at the impact from the COVID also, our studies found that the households with higher education, for example, had far better, far better from the pandemic than those with very little education, and that's going to be the similar story for the recovery also. Next, please. This is just an interesting things that we did also on the surveys. Only 39 families reported receiving any kinds of support from NGOs, but even when the NGOs, the civil society and the international organizations supporting households, only 15 families of the 39 families hold ID poor. So it appears that the NGOs doesn't have a systematic way of identifying who needs what kind of help. And interestingly, none of the families, and this is something that they actually wanting to keep on expressing their frustrations, none of the households said that they want any masks or any sanitizers. They didn't ask for it, and that seems to be the helps they get the most from NGOs. Let's wrap up my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Virak. Before we turn over to Sapal, I wanted to just make mention, I should have before, we have a chat box if you'd like to ask questions after everyone has spoken. And so if you do have a question, please pose it in our chat box and kindly identify yourself and your institutional affiliation. Thank you. So Sapal, it's over to you. Sapal? Hello?
So Paul, it looks like you're muted. We'll need you to unmute.
Oh, I apologize.
That's okay.
Let me go straight to the presentation. As Melanie presented earlier, the survey of the micro, small, and medium enterprises in the tourism sector in Cambodia was conducted in July 2020. So we should bear in mind that the findings now speak as of July last year. Back then, we found quite severe impact on both the registered and non-registered SMEs. But the impact was more severe on the registered ones. There's a big, actually notable difference by types of businesses and even areas or regions of where they were located. Siem Reap was the most affected as it relied most heavily on tourism. We found the reduction was not only in international tourists, but also the domestic ones. Now, with regards to the government programs in intervention, there was good awareness of it, but very few have received it by then. And there were mixed perceptions about the future prospects. But overall, back again in July last year, there was quite a high level of uncertainty, but at the same time, quite a level of optimism. Next, please. So let me go to some details. I'm afraid that we have to show you a lot of percentage numbers, but the main points now here is just to point out that in July, when we conducted the survey, we asked the respondents to compare to the partial lockdown time, which was in from March to April. So as the bar charts show, 65% actually completely locked down, closed down in July, while they did so only 39% in the partial lockdown. In Cambodia, we never had a complete lockdown time. So, and we could see the registered ones suffered more than the non-registered. Next, please. Yeah, that's only 33% of the registered, 33% of registered completely stopped business, and 61% had decreased their revenue, had seen their revenue decrease more than 50%. So more or less, it's done like 95 or more, about 90% either shut down or could generate less than 50% of their revenue. Next. Just to go a bit more details in terms of types of businesses. So we interview a range of tourism services. Here we can see the hardest hit were travel agents, tourism, transportation, because they were so reliant on tourists. Souvenir shops also quite hit. Then restaurants, hotels, guest houses. And overall, the registered one, because of their size and their more exposure to international tourists, they're hardest hit or hit harder by the impact. And next. We asked whether they believe they could go on. And we could see that those who say very high risk of survival, pretty high, more than 50% of total, 55% overall said they would not survive. Among the registered one, as high as 68% thought they could not survive. And then the moderate risk, low risk, fewer expressed they would see lower risk or no risk, much fewer. Next, please. Businesses took different measures to survive during the hard time. Like but unfortunately, around 50% had to lay off their workers or staff, or they had to reduce the number of working hours if the workers had to stay or were still engaged. And overall, the employees received very little from government assistance. This was back in July again. We understand that later from our discussion with government officials, assistance from government to laid off workers or suspended workers in both tourism sectors and the industry, like the manufacturing sectors, were better later on. And also the social assistance to poor households were improved, much improved after July. Next, please. So again, in terms of government programs and interventions, and there were a few that put out by government. First one was the tax and fee exemptions, and 59% of the SMEs interviewed said they received it, and that quite a bit. Then it's followed by rental bills negotiations. This is promoted by government to ask businesses or landlords to show some understanding by not charging a full amount of rental. Then government also requested banks and microfinance institutions to allow some debt restructuring, and 42% of those in the survey said they could have it. But quite a high number said they didn't have the social assistance. 93% didn't have it. Then even the government request for temporary exemption for utility bills for workers on businesses. 87% said no. Technical training back then also 85% of the surveyors SMEs said no to, they didn't receive any technical training. Next, please. Yeah, we asked whether they had to change their business models to adapt. Only 12%. Again, we have to bear in mind it was in July last year. Later on, maybe more have done so. Only 12% back then have changed their business models, and quite good achievement, as high as 44% said they went online for sales, or they rely more on online measures for their outreach. And 36.67% said they, of those who changed their business models, said they even introduced new products or services. So that was quite promising. Next, please. And here, the good success of adaptations to the COVID-19 situation. So only 8% of businesses said they were successful in adapting, and about 30 or 32% actually still generated low sales or revenues from their new business models. So mixed results here. So these, have been the key highlights of the survey. In the report, we have a lot more details to show. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sopal. We're now going to open it up for questions and comments. We have a few already. Sochea Nem poses a question to Mr. Sopal. He says, do you know from the study why registered MSMEs suffer more than their counterparts? How do you measure the severity in your study?
The registered ones tend to be larger. Actually, they are mostly medium-sized enterprises. So the larger the businesses in tourism sector were more exposed to the shock caused by the COVID-19 impact. The micro ones tend to be not registered, so they cater for different customers, local people also, and there were waves of even high levels of local tourists at certain times, like the compensation for the Khmer New Year holiday also saw a lot of people going out and spending. As they were partially locked down for some time, they were happy to get around when they were able to. So the less formal businesses were still hit, but not as severe as the larger size. Actually, we had to bear in mind that we didn't interview the large hotels, like those with 4 stars and 5 stars, because they were not mediums. They were considered larger enterprises, and many of them just shut down. You know, they went bankrupt. Now the severity, we didn't have any robust measures in measuring severity. We just asked them in terms of numbers and percentage. Like more of those who said they closed, they could generate less than 50% of the sales. So we just count, like do the counting, simple statistics.
Let me just take the prerogative of the chair and follow up with a couple of questions based on what you just said, Sopal. You talked about medium-sized enterprises. How many, do you measure a medium-sized enterprise by number of workers or revenue generated or some combination of the two?
We use the formal definitions in the tourism law, which stipulates the size by number of employees, like 1 to 10, and under 10 is micro, 10 to, I remember, 100 small, and then, you know, I remember correctly, the 500 is medium and about that large.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just another quick question is that I read the report yesterday, and there were, in the report, it says in Siem Reap, many reopened enterprises have gone for weeks without income. and they continue to operate because they have other sources of income to sustain their businesses. What are they doing to sustain their businesses? What other kinds of work? Can you give an example of that?
We didn't, I think, ask in the survey. We didn't probe for that question actually. Okay. We should bear in mind we actually have 3 rounds of survey we conducted because of the change. The situation changed. Like earlier, people were not so pessimistic as they thought the situation would become normalized maybe in a few months. Different expectation, different understanding or perceptions by different people. But now, actually, COVID actually hit Cambodia worse later last year, much worse than July. So the situation became worse. So that's why we conducted the 2nd round in October, and we will be doing the 3rd round of interviews in February. But I have a bit of information from other sources. Some businesses took the chance to do different things, like they provided if the restaurants they do more delivery. They advertise their products online more, and they do delivery. But others didn't have many chances. Other hotels took the time to do renovation, you know, and they got support from government for their employees, $40 a month, and they gave a bit more, and they got staff to do some work only on a part-time basis. And some hotels could get some local customers, but otherwise, on the whole, still situation is still quite bad.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jaun Panith in Cambodia, and he would like to know why did NGOs support only 39 families? And the second question, can you forecast how long COVID will impact in the future? I think that it was Virak that you were talking about the 39 families and support from NGOs. Maybe you could answer that question.
That number was higher in June. The 39 families was from April, and the household, the number of household. And this is, we're talking about 39 in the proportion of 1,068 families. Right. That number is actually higher to, I think, 100-something families, and we expected that number to be higher in October in our October study. But also NGOs, I think it's easy to know because I'm in the civil society NGO world for more than 15 years. I think NGOs are not capable. We don't have the level of in deep pocket or the level of support we can provide. It's just not there, and I think the delivery by the NGO has always been less systematic than one would imagine it would be. And this is why the ID Poor program has been very interesting, because that was actually used to bank transfer, make wire transfer, electronic transfer of cash to poor households, and that's been a significant policy decisions and response by the Cambodian government, and that's something that I think more and more people need to focus on and push for. As the survey said, I think 80% of the population said they need more money, and 20% said they need more food. And I go back to and elaborate a bit more on agriculture. Our October studies indicating that 68% of the households, I'm talking about poor household, said that they're actually now partial farmers. And that number is actually a lot higher than the 40% pre-COVID. But also one of the findings that we got, which is really interesting, is that much of the farm produce that they harvest, much of their harvest are actually going toward their own consumption and not for trade, not for sales. It's indication that there's an intriguing sophisticated form of resiliencies that was built into the Cambodian household support network and infrastructure. Of course, I think family size are getting smaller and smaller, but in the old days, everybody have access to farmland, and that's no longer the case for many people, for a lot more people than, let's say, 10, 20 years ago. But that's still the main fallback insurance plan for many of the households, for many of the families to go back. Farms have better access to food.
Okay, thank you. Our next question comes from Douglas Clark. He says a return to part-time farming was mentioned. What has been the impact on the resource base, cutting forested area to cultivate land, for example?
We couldn't tell, but as I said, I used to run the Cambodian Center for Human Rights, and one of the things we did was actually one of the main part of our work during that period was the land grabbing. And there was a significant shift away from small household farms to large landholders. They're not necessarily farming on those lands. There's also significant deforestation. Much of it is actually shifting these land use toward plantations and other use. So we kind of know these things happening. In fact, 80% of the Cambodian farmers own less than half a hectare of land, and that means that even if during the pandemic, during COVID-19, many of the family members who are migrating to work in the cities or abroad in Thailand, for example, many of them, even if they return back to their village, they return back to a very small plot for a family of 5. And this is why much of their farms is going to basic food subsistence and nothing more. And one of the major impact, and this is going to be a long-lasting impact of COVID-19, will be a further shift in a significant way, probably at a higher rate, at a higher speed. And that shift from small household land ownership, real estate ownership, to fewer and fewer hands. As you can see from the survey, and people asking about the number of deaths, for example, and as I said earlier, it's difficult to pinpoint to why, but of course I think there's possibility that they borrow more money from their families to pay off high interest debt, for example. But one thing, there's correlations between that, the level of debts, or the amount of average amount of debts that has decreased. It has correlation to the asset sales. There's an increase in asset sales over the past months, over the past within the 2020, and that means as more and more of these small family land, for example, will likely be changing hand, and those people who can afford to hold on to money and can afford to use it to acquire more properties and more land, they're likely to do it now, because the suppressions of land price means that shift will, and the necessary of selling assets to survive means that there will be a shift even so toward smaller and smaller hands.
Okay, thank you. Our next question comes from a student in Cambodia named Sophia Chuan. The question is to Vivek. The survey interviewed approximately 1,000 households. And from the finding, COVID-19 almost has no impact on food insecurity. Why might this be the case?
Actually, it has impact on food insecurity. That number has climbed up. I think it was from 10% or so to now about 20% of food insecurity. And we're talking moderate and severe food insecurity. So it's an indication that there are a lot more people falling back below the poverty line, at least not from income. Even from the income perspective, we've seen the reductions in income, but even the access to food perspective, in terms of food poverty, that number is pretty scary. With very little, with absolutely nothing in savings, as you said, as you see, 2/3 of the populations have no savings. If there's and the numbers shows also there's assets, there's a rise in asset sale, so that means they have no saving and no hard assets left. If the crisis continue or new crisis, then the food insecurity situation will only get far worse.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Dr. Judy Ledgerwood, an anthropologist and former director of the Center of Southeast Asian Studies and dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Northern Illinois University. She says, on the issue of some people paying off debts, could it be that they are using funds from informal sources like tontine or high interest informal lenders?
We don't know, to be honest. We don't know. I suspect that I don't believe that to be the case. I think it has more to do with reductions in saving as well as asset sales, and probably reductions of high price ticket items. For example, there's probably a lot lower purchase of that. There's a lot of numbers that indicating that people buying fewer motorcycles, fewer cars, for example, during the pandemic, and that seems to be maybe one possible reason that they know that they cannot afford to pay the interest, and therefore, if they can, they want to pay it off rather than keeping the money to buy motorcycle or investing in their tractors for their farms, for example.
Virak, just to follow up on that, could you maybe illustrate this with an example, a sense of what might be an average loan and what would be the interest rate that a household would borrow from?
The average loan was at around $3,000 per loan. The interest rate was recently capped by the National Bank at 18% per year. It's high, but it's a lot lower than what it used to be. But that number doesn't tell the whole story. As we all know, if you put a cap on the rate, there's different ways to charge the desperate lenders and desperate borrowers. But that number has been coming down because of stability. There's more big lenders coming in, more international lenders coming in, which has already pushed the interest rate a bit lower.
These loans, what would be the average term of these loans in months or years?
I don't have that information, but the scariest part of the loan was, the law say one thing, and that is, for example, that many of these loans needs to be used for productive purpose. For example, that was actually the real reason behind microfinance in the beginning. But there's no reasons why lenders have any incentive to do that, because they depend on land, particularly farmland, houses, as collateral for many of these loans, and this is why we have seen more land sales. Sometimes to actually was pressured by the lender to pay back their debts also.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Brendan Stewart at the Stimson Center. He'd like to know if there's any information on how the impact that farmer debt and food insecurity has had on people outside of the tourism sector and, for example, the garment sector, and has this changed much during the time of COVID-19? And as we know, the garment sector is a very large employer, and its biggest market, or one of its biggest markets, certainly export markets, is the United States. So if you could answer that question,
Well, many of there's two. I mean, many of the garment factory workers have lost their job. I'm looking at, I think the number I remember was 20 something or 30%. Some of them actually decided to leave their work out of fear of COVID, because they don't want to work in the congested in the cramped factory. And they move back home to join their family in their home village, for example. But half of that is actually because the factory was closing. There's fewer working hours, so that impact has been significant also. Actually, the situation for food insecurity seems to be improving in our October study. And in October, there's some recovery in saving also. I don't have the exact percentage yet. We're still doing the analysis, but there seems to be recovery in October, which is quite early, to be frank. That's a bit surprising, but there seems to be recovering, including some income, not pre-COVID level, but if we compare to June, for example, which is actually at the lowest point. There seems to be some recovery in October. Our study cover far wider, a lot more wider areas than what I had presented this evening. But so if you want to have access, for example, our analysis on agriculture and on farmers, visit our website, www.futureforum.asia. And you should be able to find the policy briefs, the briefs on different sectors, including the wage earners also.
Thank you.
May I
Our
take
next question.
part?
Oh, go ahead, Supal.
For the garment, the question on the garment industry, because the Asia Foundation and ACIRS, the American Center for Labor Solidarity, sponsored CPS, our organization, to conduct a survey on workers in both the garment and tourism sectors, those who were affected severely by the COVID situation. So we took a sample from around 260,000 workers who were considered suspended from their employment or laid off. So we took a good sample of 1,525, and we did online survey or interviews by phone. Now, just to say, they were badly hit by July again, but those in the garment industries had returned to work already by October, most of them. Somehow those factories could find orders and could find work for the workers. So the situation is not as bad in the garment industry compared to the tourism sector. The tourism sector has continued to be hit hard till now. Yeah, so we also asked questions about their coping strategies, and they reported having to cut expenditure on food. So that is confirming what the Viras has been saying on his study. And they also had to return, some of them had to return home or to their home villages in order to save cost. But not every village. We also conducted focus group discussions in 50 villages of different types of opportunities for absorbing labor, like the rice cultivation villages, the predominantly fishing, animal raising, and the new areas. New areas tend to be formerly forested, some conversion from forest to agriculture happening. Those areas could absorb more labor. Otherwise, in established agricultural villages, not many opportunities for employment. A lot of agriculture now is mechanized too, so less chances for laborers. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is for you, Sopal. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, but he was, Mr. Boparath Sri is asking what type of businesses probably had the most success in terms of generating revenue than its counterparts during COVID-19?
Could you repeat?
Sure. Can you name a business that has been successful in terms of generating revenue during the pandemic?
In overall or in the tourism sector?
Overall, if you want to say in the tourism sector, but I think the question, the way I'm interpreting it, is overall.
Oh,
but if you can answer the question the way you best see fit.
Okay. Those who have been selling masks, of course. I don't see many businesses doing well, except, again, and not a joke, those who selling the things that people need the most, these personal, what is it, PPE, equipment, things like that.
Can I add a bit there?
Virat may have more information.
The study we found was that the farmers, particularly livestock, those people who actually sell, who's raising livestock are doing quite well during the pandemic. There's an increase in demand. Delivery, for example, was on the rise, and that could have a longer term impact on the commerce in the country. There seems to be an expedite process now of actually going online as well, with more and growing number of delivery services that has been on the rise. Grocery stores, there's a lot more people eating at home instead of traveling and eating at restaurants. Those are the people who's actually going to come out ahead. But in terms of farmers overall, in terms of particularly crops, farmers, they're not doing well. The output has increased, but the price has been down because of, as I said, there's more people going to farming, so which means there's higher supply, and that's just your farmer's cost 101.
Okay. Yeah. In the interest,
actually, recently, some farmers have been making more money from rice production in the past month. The price of rice has been rising highly but there are not many of them who have the harvest during this time. It's just the water receding rice. Also, cassava is good now in terms of price. Now, the Ministry of Finance made the public forum today, and they reported good diversification in the manufacturing sector. The non-garment manufacturing parts have been increasing. Bicycle export has been increasing. A few other things also have been rising.
Okay.
Thank you.
We are running out of time. I will ask one more question before we begin to wrap up. And so for those whose questions I haven't gotten to, my apologies. There's a question from Mr. or Ms. Tokiwa. And the question is for Virak. Could you elaborate on any differences found in how wealthier households weathered last year versus poorer households? Is there the differences in how wealthier households derive their income as opposed to poorer, or did they have better access to support programs? Virak?
Sorry, I forgot to mute them. Yeah, I don't think there's more program to supporting the wealthier household, but our study shows that the educated class or the level of education do have direct links to the impact of the COVID, and it has something to do with the nature of their job. I mean, the service, even if you're a lawyer, in the service sector, you're less likely, or the knowledge sector, you're less likely to be affected by the COVID could be also has something to do with contracts, for example. Contract employees tend to have less of an impact in terms of losing job or with reductions in their wage. One of the things the study show, for example, and this is also, I think, from Bonza Powell's study, and that is also negotiations to lower the wage of their staff. And this is something that businesses all across the board has been doing to either reduce the hours, but also to reduce the wage, and workers have very little choice but to accept that. That means a trickle down all the way to not just household level, but also at the very rural household who depend on their able children to send remittances home.
Thank you. We're just about out of time, so it's time for maybe to wrap up. I don't know, Melanie, if you had any comments you'd like to make before we adjourn.
Thanks, John. This is I've been working with Sopal and Virak and the teams over the past 6 or 7 months, and really, I think one of the things that strikes me about this particular effort, which has been certainly it's been a rapid effort to sort of take the pulse of what's going on at a certain period of time, so that then over time we'll have some comparative data, is that we've just shown a very limited or selected set of points here today. And there's just so much more rich data that can really be looked at more carefully. We can do a lot more disaggregation. And I'm very excited that as we go forward, we're going to have, I think, a really an important body of data that we can really draw more lessons from and more understanding on really what's happening on the ground here in Cambodia. So it's just been great working with everybody over at Future Forum and CPS and of course Anchor Research on this important effort. And I also just want to say how critical it has been for us to all along the way get key interlocutors in government, civil society, and other stakeholders, their views in terms of just putting this whole thing together, to think about what are the questions we want to ask, what are the parts of the country what we want to focus on, and various issues. But I think we've had great receptivity to being a part of this process, and we look forward to continuing that sort of engagement going forward. So, and thank you, John, for enabling us to speak to an audience outside of Cambodia today, in the morning, your time. It's been a lot of fun. So thank you so much for inviting us in.
Well, thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Virak and Sopal. You know, as you mentioned, the programs on Cambodia are infrequent in Washington in general, even when there isn't a pandemic. And I think to be able to have the technology today, to be able to talk about what's going on in Cambodia, the challenges that the country is facing. I mean, you know, listening to both of you, Virak and Sopal, talking about household debt, food insecurity, unemployment. These are issues that also face the United States. It's a matter of degree. Maybe the difference might be in terms of what kind of assistance is provided and where people can be able to get assistance. I see that where there's a difference in the U.S. and Cambodia, but we're also talking about apples and oranges here in terms of the a developed economy as opposed to a developing economy. But nonetheless, the challenges are daunting for citizens in Cambodia, the United States, and elsewhere. I want to thank the both of you again, and Melanie for for speaking today. We had as many as 75 people join us in today's webinar in Cambodia and around the United States. And I think a sign of any successful program is when you have more questions than time allotted to be able to provide answers. So again, for those who haven't been able to get the last couple of questions answered, my apologies. And thank you all for joining us, and we will see you again. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Take care. Thank you, Vera.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. All the best.